All right, and we're live. I don't want to give too much time. I normally give just a moment for people to come in and get situated to get ready to be a part of this, but I don't want to take too much time. It's our first one back for this year, so I appreciate my guest that's here with me today. This is going to be a little bit of a different one. I think it's going to be quite special in that sense. And then also I appreciate those who are already here, ready to go with us right off the bat, some of the fellows from my church. And then those who will join us later, I appreciate that as well. It has been since the beginning of December since we got to do one of these. We're supposed to do a few throughout December, and just with Christmas and everything, they got canceled. So we're glad to be back. We won't be doing one. I'll go ahead and get that out of the way first. We won't be doing one next week. I think I'm telling you my schedule correctly. We won't be doing one next week, but after that, we have one every Saturday till the end of February, with the exception of one Saturday in February. So as we get closer to that, I'll announce about that. All right. So I want to say, first of all, that I appreciate my guest, Dr. Kevin Folger. Brother Folger is the pastor emeritus at Cleveland Baptist Church. I do have to make an amendment. Me and him were talking about this before we started, that in Ohio, most Baptist churches are called Baptist Temple, which he explained to me, and now I know why. I didn't know the reason for that in the past, but that's why I kept calling it Baptist Temple. So I give my apologies to the church, even though nobody probably knows I messed it up. But I do appreciate the work and the ministry they have there. I've actually heard about them a whole lot. I've listened to him preach for quite a while now. I listen to his son from time to time, since he's the senior pastor there and preaching most of the messages. Brother, can you tell me how long you pastored there at the church?
So altogether, I was on the staff right at 41 years. I served 17 years coming out of college, kind of worked my way through just different things. I was an intern, then worked to an associate pastor position, then became co-pastor. And that was in 1990. And then in September of 1995, September 3rd, 1995, I became the senior pastor. So it was 24 years as the senior pastor, almost. So altogether, 41 years of ministry at Cleveland Baptist.
That's really great. All right. Well, you also are part of a ministry that I want you to take a little bit of time in a moment to teach people about as part of a spiritual leadership conference that helps. I think your main focus is in Asia, but I'm sure you're happy to help anywhere in the world you can with this. But it's part of a conference that focuses on training up men. And so I'll get you to explain in a little while what all that means for everybody. But that's why we're doing it a little bit different, is that when I have somebody who I feel like has the capacity to carry a whole thing by themselves and also has an expertise and a long time in the field like that, I like to give them a little more room to breathe. And especially when it's a subject like this that they themselves are more passionate about. And so I really appreciate you taking the time out to join us. The subject we're going to be dealing with is that idea of spiritual leadership, because I do want it to be a little bit more applicable to just the layperson in the church. We'll talk some about pastoral authority and that kind of stuff, because I think that does connect at least a little bit. And so hopefully we can answer your questions. I do really encourage everybody. So because I'm going to be quiet for a little while after I finish what I have to say here. So let me get this one thing out of the way, is that be sure to ask your questions. Your comments can be seen. They will be read. I may have to wait a second, especially if I'm talking. I'm not going to pause mid-sentence to read them. So be patient, but be sure to submit your questions, comments, those sort of things, because if you have a valid question, we'll introduce it into our discussion and we'll ask Dr. Folger for you the question. So we'll have that opportunity to address it. And then also even comments are welcome, because sometimes some really good insight comes in through those comments. So we would appreciate those. Be sure to submit them. Today, again, we're doing a little bit different in that I only have one guest. We won't be doing a lot of discussion between multiple guys, because there's just the two of us. Instead, this will be a little bit closer to an interview in the style of how we're going to do it. And so with that said, I want to give the majority of time going forward to Dr. Folger, so he has opportunity to teach it about these subjects and answer whatever questions we have. And the question I'm going to use to introduce all of this is in the idea of spiritual leadership. Why is it so important that we train men in this subject? And so I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Folger, give him some time to answer that, and then we'll go into discussion and more afterwards. But I'll let you answer the question of why it's so important that we train men in this.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you, Brother Haley, to you and to the church for providing this venue for us to have some opportunity to share what the Lord is doing in our hearts and our lives. You asked me opening how long I was at the Cleveland Baptist Church. In 2017, God really began to stir in my heart in regards to the fact that my time at the church was coming to an end. It was because I was so old that I couldn't do it anymore, or that they were trying to get rid of me, or that we were tired of each other. It's just that I shared with our church a week ago as I had the opportunity to preach the first Sunday night of January, that God was stirring up my nest. And he does that from time to time. I think for 41 years in one place is a long time. The founding pastor was there for 37 years, and so I was there for 24. So up until June the 2nd of 2019, they just had two pastors in their almost 60-year history. So anyway, God was just stirring in my heart in regards to a change of ministry. Didn't know exactly what that meant. I just knew that pastoring probably was coming to an end. So I had the opportunity in 2016 to travel to Manila to be at the Spiritual Leadership Conference of Asia. Dr. Paul Chappell, of course, pastor of Lancaster Baptist Church in Lancaster, California, has been a friend of mine since I started pastoring back in 1995. God just kind of brought our lives together. He had been in Lancaster for a few years, and I had just taken the church in Cleveland, and we were in a meeting together, and God kind of just brought our lives together. And so he became an encourager and a help to me, and I tried to be a help to him. So he invited me to be a part of that particular conference in Asia, and it's a conference that had gone on for a couple of years. In 2015, they did a leadership conference in Singapore, and then moved it to Manila based upon the fact that it seemed like Manila was an easier city to get in and out of and more cost effective than Singapore to conduct such a conference. So when I was at the 2016 conference, I was really thrilled by what we were seeing. We had 2,000 or 3,000 folks show up for the evening services, and God just seemed to open up the windows of heaven, and just a great spirit, different nations from Asia there, with a focus on reaching specifically what we call the 1040 window. Most folks perhaps would be familiar with that, the 1040 window. And of course, it talks about a geographical location. It's not a phrase, I don't think, that Independent Baptists originated, although I think we obviously, most people in evangelical Christianity would be familiar with it. But it deals with 10 degrees north of the equator to 4 degrees north of the equator, starting on the west side of Africa, moving to the east. You go across the top of Africa into Europe, across the Middle East, then into Asia. And when you get to Asia, we like to drop the box down to 10 degrees south of the equator to 40 degrees north. And in that box, we have approximately a third of the world's land mass. On a third of the world's land mass in that particular region lives 2/3 of the world's population, over 5 billion people. Many of the largest cities in the world are located in this 1040 region. Many what we call closed or restricted access nations are there. It's the least evangelized, Christian evangelized realm of the world. So when we went to this conference, there was just an emphasis on reaching the 1040 window. And what we have come to realize, of course, is that we as Americans, I say myself as an American, sometimes Americans have this idea that, hey, if the world's going to be reached, it's going to be reached by Americans. Well, the truth of the matter is that God has other nations and other people, and we're not the sole possessors or sole owners of the Great Commission. And specifically when it comes to reaching a particular realm of the world where perhaps for an American it's more difficult to get there or stay there, even be able to be welcomed into that particular nation. But we found that God has raised up an army, so to speak, of Asians from specifically Southeast Asia who are ready and have been trained, many of them excited about making a difference in the world for the cause of Jesus Christ with the Great Commission. So I was there in 2016, and then I was invited back to be a part of the 2018 conference. It's become a biannual conference every 2 years. So when we went back in 2018, it just grew exponentially. So we were like a couple thousand in the evening services, where on Thursday night of the meeting in 2018, we had over 6,000 in attendance. And we had 49 different nations represented. We had people from just about every tribe nation on the face of the globe. I know there's more than 49, but it was quite amazing just to see this gathering of brethren and sisters who had come together because God had brought them to this place. And so we had a 350 voice choir, we had a 150 piece orchestra, and these primarily Filipinos were just singing to God's glory. Great preaching, great teaching during the day. We'd break the room down into smaller segments. And out of that, we saw 150 people surrender their lives to say, hey, we want to go to this realm of the world and find our place to serve the Lord. So when I was there in 2018, God had stirred my heart in 2017. God basically said, this is it. This is what I want you to give your time to here in these, what I call the final quarter of my life. So I'm 63 years old. I was going on my 61st birthday when I turned the church over. And so I just felt like God had given us an opportunity to come alongside of Brother Chappell and some other folks who had a real heart for this. But it was an every 2-year program. And I said to them, we see a lot of momentum coming out of this conference. We need to do something to capitalize on this conference. And these folks that are surrendering, to see what we can do to perpetuate this momentum that we're gaining and not lose it until we come back together again in another couple of years. And so we met in August of 2018 in Lancaster, myself and Brother Chappell and another gentleman by the name of Naranjan Sundaraj. Naranjan was born in Sri Lanka and became a very educated, godly Christian man in business. He was at that point the vice president of American Express of all of Asia. But God had stirred in his heart as he traveled across the 1040 window to see the openness of the region to the gospel. So Spiritual Leadership Asia really is about helping train, facilitate, and encourage those folks in Asia, Asians going to Asia. And so we want to provide training, we want to provide resources, we want to provide encouragement, we want to provide financial resources as we're able, just to encourage and help folks go to places we can't go and stay places where we can't stay. And we're seeing God do some great things as God is opening up the door. We were scheduled to be in Manila again in 2020. Of course, COVID came, and so we ended up canceling that meeting. So we thought maybe we could do it this year, 2021. That's not going to happen because of COVID still being a vital aspect, specifically in Asia. So right now we've pushed our time frame to March 1 to 5, 2022 back in Manila. So I'd like to invite any of the folks that are listening, if you've got a heart for being a part of something very special and can make your way to Manila. And 2 websites I encourage folks to visit. One is sl-asia.com, sl-asia.com. And then it's SL, Spiritual Leadership Conference Asia.com. So those 2 websites basically have a lot of information. But the sl-asia.com, there's a link there. It'll take you to the other one. I also have a website, kevinfolger.com, where I have an itinerary there, just some things about our life and what we're trying to accomplish. But basically, when I think about this idea of training spiritual leaders, I think about what Paul said in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse number 2, as he spoke to young Timothy, and he said, "And the things that thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also." So here's what we know: is we know this. We know that the Great Commission is not just the gospel. It's not just preaching the gospel and people getting saved. It's salvation, baptism, discipleship through the local church. And of course, when we think about the local church, we think about the fact that sometimes churches of like faith can come together and have a conference that's perhaps larger than just one particular local church, where people can see brethren come together of the same doctrinal persuasion and have such sweet harmony, and then God just do something in a significant conference. And of course, the Spiritual Leadership Conference of Asia is kind of patterned after what Dr. Chappell does at the Spiritual Leadership Conference in Lancaster every year, in the fact that it brings preachers in to preach and preachers in to teach, to try to encourage folks in just soul winning, church planting, discipleship. So, when we think about the 1040 window, we think about the fact that the Great Commission, Jesus said to go into all the world, not just to some of the world, not just where it's convenient, but we need to go into all the world. And so we realize that this particular realm of Asia is an area that's been neglected with the gospel. Some of it's just because of the hardness. Some of it's because of a false religion, locking doors. The primary religions in the Asian focused area of the 1040 would be Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam. So those three religions, of course, as false religions, when they take a stronghold and they become the predominant religion, they want to make it so that no one else can speak or no one else can share a different voice. And so as a result of that, we're finding that, there's an opportunity, because we do believe there's an openness. We believe God has prepared people to hear the gospel. So, Brother Haley, think with me for just a moment about you're in a pretty strong area where the gospel is very well needed there in Belgium. But, I don't know what the predominance of Christianity is, but most of these places we're talking about in Asia, less than 2% of the population, probably in most places would be less than 0.5%. So less than 1% of the population would be evangelical Christian, and predominantly other false religions. So if we could get folks in there, and sometimes they have to go in with a worker visa or an education visa or a business visa. But if we can get them in there and they can begin to share the gospel, people are coming to trust Christ as their Lord and Savior. And, we're seeing churches planted. We're seeing God do a great work. And we believe that this is what God wants to have happen here in these final days before the Lord returns. And I do believe we're there. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 9 that, that we are to pray to the Lord of the harvest that he would send forth laborers, because truly the harvest is plenteous, but the laborers are few. We're to pray to the Lord of the harvest and he'd send forth laborers into his harvest. So one generation has a responsibility to train and prepare another generation. And just as I prepared a successor to take the pulpit at the Cleveland Baptist Church, of course, the folks there had to approve of him and call him to be their pastor. I couldn't call him, but I trained and had a part of training my son so that he could take my place. We need to see the same thing happen across the face of the globe. As those of us who've walked in the faith for a while know the Lord have been called to ministry, to train another generation coming behind us so that they're ready and can step up and carry on the baton of the gospel to the next generation as we wait for the Lord to return. And we're to occupy, so we need to stay busy. And so that's part of really what our heart is, to make a difference.
All right. Yeah. As far as the statistics, I mean, I don't want to get sidetracked talking about Belgium, but here we have a population of about 11 million people and a land size about exactly the same size as the state of Maryland. So for Americans, that's an easy thing to picture. Just take Maryland and literally double it, because it's 5.5 million people in Maryland. So that's where we stand in terms of religion. Let's say around 50% identify legally as being Catholic, but that means that they were baptized as a baby and have probably never been back since. I think practicing Catholics, when I first come here, they said the number was around 100,000 actual practicing Catholics in the country. And then there's a huge amount of Muslim. Islam has a strong hold here. And then you also are seeing, really quite surprisingly to me, the New Age movement is becoming very big here. In terms of,
I think that goes along with just the idea of enlightenment, supposedly education, enlightenment, and godless, secularism. It just, same thing's happening here in the United States of America. The godless culture is sweeping through.
I think you see something here, though, is very much the same issue you would see in those countries from the men I know. I've done Bible studies with men in India and different countries. I've tried to help as much as I could with a lot of people. And so my experience has been that in any of those countries, it's generally because a certain religion and a certain political philosophy controls the country. People are just miseducated, especially like Muslim countries. My experience has always been that you start talking about stuff and it's basic principles, you'll find that they've just been lied to, but they've never questioned it because this is what they're taught in school their entire life. This is going to be laughable, but one of the ones that has become almost a joke amongst our group here at the church, because we have some men who are Muslim who've gotten saved and some men we're working with even now. But in Islam, they always teach, that the stone there that they go to and they pray, that's a big part of their pilgrimage. That's the most magnetic point in the entire earth. And I just stopped and thought about that for a second when one of the men was saying that to me. And I said, well, I can tell you one easy reason why that can't be true. I don't have my degree in electrical engineering. I studied it enough to know, though, that the most magnetic point of any magnet is the North and the South Pole. So you can't have this one big magnet right in the middle of nowhere. And they've thought about that for a second. And there's just so many things we found over time that they've just been lied to throughout their lives. And that's usually what I find when I'm witnessing to a Muslim, is they've just been lied to their whole life and they ate it up. And I'm saying that because where you're working at, I think the same issue is true. That's my experience with the area. But also here in Belgium, that's going to be a lot of the same issue, is that the religion of evolution is taught here. I mean, it is, you are beating your head with it to where there's no choice, but you have to believe this. The Catholic Church controls a huge part of the government. And so there's so many things that when you talk to people that should just be basic knowledge, in my opinion, people have never been taught that. They've never heard. They've just been lied to their whole lives about stuff. And that's why I think that a program like this is so important, especially as a missionary. If I can give just this one thing of commending it, is that my experience with pastors in that area is that it's not that there's so much a lack of zeal or opportunity, but a lack of training. I know a man right now that he went to the Philippines just to visit, and then he wound up spending the rest of his life there trying to start a Bible college, because when he got there, people were conducting the Lord's Supper with Coca-Cola and Doritos, and had no reason why that wasn't the right way to do it. They'd never been taught anything. It wasn't that they were trying to be disrespectful to what they were doing. They just didn't know anything different. Now, I know other parts of the world where people say they do it that way because they don't have anything else to do it with, but that's a whole other issue. I'm just saying that from my experience, the lack of leadership being taught within a lot of places to national preachers and national missionaries is very high.
We're finding that in particular, if I can interrupt, in these areas that specifically where, in my mind, I go back to the 1950s, 1960s. I grew up in the church I ended up pastoring. So the church got started in a house my grandfather lived in. And so my family started attending the second Sunday of the church's existence. I was just a 9-month-old baby at that point. But anyway, I grew up around these missionaries that had come out of the Baptist Bible College out of Springfield, Missouri. And our church back in those days was very much affiliated with Baptist Bible College. Our pastor graduated there. And so a lot of the missionaries that were coming through, many of them were heading to the Philippines to plant churches. Guys like Boyd Lyons, who's been in the Philippines for 60 years now as a missionary. And, just some other names that would be familiar. But Bob Hughes was there. And so a lot of these Americans had gone back in the 50s and 60s after World War II, had planted some very significant churches and had Bible colleges. And many of those now, of course, are run by nationals. And you've got of course, Rick Martin there in Iloilo, and Brother Martin has probably helped plant 1,000 churches out in the Philippines. So we're seeing that these Filipinos are going places to plant these churches in the 1040 window. And what they're finding, of course, is an ignorance to gospel truth. And so they now are trying to run Bible institutes and do those type of things to train the nationals that are in these various, like Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, whether it be Korea or, China. I mean, they're in just different places, and God has opened up the door and they're stepping through it. I know some Filipinos that are in Dubai planning an independent Baptist church. And so I'm just saying that, God's doing something. And I think, the idea of training the national and saying, well, the Americans have to do it. I'm just thinking specifically in some of these places that Americans are not going to do it. We can help them, but we're never going to be able to go and stay and do what needs to be done. And so thank God for the training that's already taken place. And now those folks are taking the responsibility for the Great Commission and going throughout places where we could never go.
The idea of Americans going, I mean, just for example, with India, I have friends who are missionaries there. And for
Hmm.
example, they will never be able to do something like this with me because they have to hide their presence. They have to delete their
Sure.
internet accounts, all these things, because it's not legal for them to be a missionary there. They
Right.
find loopholes. I mean, I have a friend in China that he's there as a teacher, I believe is how he got
Right.
in.
Hmm.
But you have to find all these different loopholes to get into a place. And that's
Sure.
why it's very hard. And so anytime you have a choice, there's going to be pros and cons with either one. And so when discussing the idea of training the national pastors, I think the negative was always the lack of training. And so when you have a program like this that the focus is to train, I
Right.
think that answers that issue, that you have an army right there, so to speak, that you can send out, but they just need
Mhm.
somebody to invest in them and teach them.
Yes, they do. They need the encouragement. They need the resources. They need to network. They need to be able to be to find others that can help them as well. So that's kind of really what happens in our conference, is that we have this networking that takes place, and folks meeting each other, and folks being encouraged. We try to bring a lot of resources to bear. We'll ship containers of scripture and tracts,
Mhm.
and Brother Chap will ship a bunch of the books from Striving Together over. And of course, try to make those things available at a marginal cost, if and sometimes no cost to the national, depending upon where we are and what's going on. So,
Let me ask one question, so I know whether I need to bite my tongue on something or not. Uh, do you bring is most all of the training conducted there, or do they bring a lot of the men over to the States for it?
no, we most of it is done there. I'm a firm believer of I know there's some Filipinos that have come, and there's even a Bible college here in Marietta, Ohio, that does a lot of training of Filipinos. I'm just not a great fan of that. I feel like we pull folks out of their element, bring them to America, and they see things here in America that are obviously not going on in the Philippines. And when they go back, it's just different. You know what I'm saying? So
We
I feel
spoil them.
like I think we'd be better to just keep them there and bring the training to them, and work through the colleges that exist, and then come alongside and enhance that through what we're trying to do. That's my philosophy.
I agree with you, and that's why I said I want to ask for I know whether
Yeah.
to bite my tongue or not,
Yeah.
because I think one of the biggest mistakes we make in terms of training men in other places to be, to reach their own area is that we take them to America because we have facilities
Right.
there already,
Right.
but then they
Right.
get very comfortable living in America, and then they never
Yes,
want to go
sir.
back.
Right.
Uh,
Or if they go back, they don't go back living like a national. They live
no.
more like an American than a national, which obviously makes them not as effective as they
Mhm.
could be. So,
And I think that's one of the things because I'm familiar with the group there in Marietta, and I'll say I met a man while I was in Ohio because I raised a lot of my support there. That he was part of that college, and he was from Papua New Guinea. And so, if we work hard enough, you can probably figure out who he is because you may have
yeah,
met him. I'm sure
I
you
know
crossed.
him. I believe him. I know who he is. Yes, sir.
There were several of them. So, but this
Yeah.
particular guy, he could preach. I mean, he had tremendous preaching ability, and I feel like God could use him greatly. But I also, that was one of the things I expressed to my wife was that I had a concern that because he came there to get his education, that I know a man who was a missionary in Papua New Guinea for decades. He had to leave eventually because of health concerns. That's what he always said is that if anybody ever left, when they came back, they were either ruined, they were spoiled, or they just never came back.
Right. Yes, sir. Yeah, it can happen.
But all
Sure.
right, well, I appreciate getting the opportunity to put that out there in terms of what the ministry itself is. I want to take and look at questions around the idea of spiritual leadership because I want to make this something that could be used to help preachers, help anybody in that area who could, come in access with this. Because I'll run this video as an advertisement once it's done, and so normally my viewership when I do that is in Asia, so we'll be hitting the right
Good.
window with that.
Good. Yeah, that's
Uh,
wonderful.
it's not unusual to have a few thousand people in Nepal alone to watch a video. So
Mm-hmm.
I
That's
don't know
good.
why we're successful in Nepal, but they like us there. But
Yeah.
I do think this is so important because I think in reality the subject spans far beyond just that central focus ministry of training men in that area. I think it's a subject that everywhere you see struggle in this. That I come from an area that I see a lot of men coming in to pastor churches where you've got churches on every corner. I live in the Bible, or I'm from the Bible Belt of the United States, And so you have all these men pastoring who, I'm not saying they needed a Bible college education. They come in with very little put into them, and they have a tremendous heart for the ministry. But once they take a church, they're really not ready for a lot of what that means. There's a lot of struggle in that for them because they weren't prepared for it. Even regardless of age, they still essentially in a lot of ways were novices. And I know I'm a young fellow, so it probably sounds hateful for me to say that, but I've been preaching for 17, 18 years now. So it was something of a lot of time put in for this for me. So I guess my first question I'd like to ask you, just to make this more accessible to everyone, is what are some basic principles that you would say people need to learn about leadership, about spiritual leadership?
Well, of course, a person's personal walk with God is so vitally important. It's not enough that we say, okay, well, I'm studying for, a message. When I was pastoring, of course, at least 4 preparations every week. So I was in the Word a lot. But it was, I had, before I ever became a pastor, I had to have a walk with God that was, I get up early, spend some time with the Lord before I would ever get myself dressed or even my family get up. And it would just help me tremendously. And I feel like sometimes if we're not careful, we neglect that side of it. It's just about, well, we got to preach. And whether you mentioned somebody that's, a guy can preach. Well, it takes more than talent. We know that, and gifts. It takes character, and character, of course, is developed through a personal walk with God. And God forbid, we're all human beings. We all have issues that we have to contend with. And, I've been saved since I was 5 years old. So we're working on, some 48 years, 58 years of being a Christian. And yet I still find that God is still working on me. There's still things he's showing me. And that comes basically through my personal spiritual development and my own walk with the Lord. So I would say that, when we talk about spiritual leadership, I think obviously a person must have their own walk with the Lord. They must. This is not something I'm forced to do. This is something I want to do. This is something that is necessary in my own life for me to be the person I ought to be. Secondly, I think, to be mentored, to have a mentor in your life, someone who's a little bit older than you, somebody who's walked the path a little bit further along. I know, Brother Haley, you're familiar with that. We're seeing in our movement some almost disparaging things that are thrown at older men in some respects, that we're throwing off some of these old guys. Are there issues in our past that have been, areas that obviously were wrong? Of course. The idea that we worship at, literally almost make a man a god, and what he says goes, regardless of, we all know that's foolish. We also know it's foolish that there were times when sin was swept under the carpet and we moved people along to different ministries without informing folks of the moral failure or whatever. We all know those things have happened. But I also want folks to be aware that it wasn't just an independent Baptist thing. That happened in many, many places, and because it's human. It's human to do those things. And I'm not trying to placate it or act as if it's not something. I'm just simply saying we know that. So I think, what we've done in some respects is we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And so now we got these young guys who know everything. You can't teach them anything. They're reformed, and they're reformed fundamentalists. They're recovering fundamentalists. They're whatever, because they're hurt. And I get it. I understand people have been hurt. But, I feel like there's ditches on both sides of the road. So if you get out of one ditch and you bounce over to the other ditch, what's the difference? You've just gone to the extreme, the other side. Instead of correcting and, maintaining a good level balance, now we've gone to the other extreme. So I think to have mentors in your life. I came out of Bible college. I'd been raised in a Christian home, raised in the church that I came back to work on the staff. But I cannot tell you how blessed I was to be mentored by the man who was my pastor, who took an interest in me and saw in me things that I didn't see in myself and helped me in my spiritual development. And so, he was 20 some years older than I was, probably 20, 25, 26 years older than me. But as a young preacher, he said, let me take you under my wing, and, gave me opportunities, standing in the pulpit of the Cleveland Baptist Church when I was, my 20s on Sunday nights, like if he was gone, or on a Sunday morning to preach to that crowd when, to me, that was just unbelievable that I had that kind of opportunity following a man like Roy Thompson, who was the founding pastor and well sought after in the United States as a great pulpiteer, but yet he invested in me. And my dad invested in me. And so having these older men pour into your life is something that's vitally important. And then I think, in our church from like the mid 1970s, we've always had like a Bible Institute in our church that operated on Monday and Tuesday nights. And it was something that, not everybody, if they're called to ministry, can go away to Bible college. They can't all pack up their families and leave their jobs. So we established Heritage Baptist Institute in the 1970s, and it continues today. It's a Monday and Tuesday night program, runs from 7 o'clock till 10 o'clock on Monday night, 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock on Tuesday night, 5 classes that are offered every semester, and with a chapel in between on Tuesday. And again, we just see a lot of our men, develop through that. And we've got missionaries, we've got pastors, we've got better trained laymen. We've seen a lot. God bless that effort. And certainly there's a place for Bible colleges. There's a place for folks to go where they get that training. But the idea of spiritual leadership is that, okay, as God develops me, I can't just sit on that. I'm supposed to do something with it. And, I found in my own life, honestly, the opportunities that God has given to me just been a little bit overwhelming because, when I was a kid growing up, probably most people would have labeled me ADHD. I just have a hard time focusing. I'm certainly not slow mentally, but my mind moves so fast many times, and it's hard to just keep it, in balance. So, my speech elements were difficult when I was a kid, sometimes stammering, stuttering. And so I just could see, a need, and yet God continued to work in my life, giving me opportunities and developing things. But I had to be willing to take the steps. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't just, okay, there's an opportunity. You got to take advantage of that opportunity. You can't say, well, I'm not doing that. It's too big for me. So I think spiritual leadership is saying, okay, God's opening the door. Believe this is what God wants me to do. And I may be uncomfortable and I may have to get out of my box, but I'm going to have to step through that door. And that was something that God did in my own life. If you go back to my Bible college days and people that I trained with in ministry, probably most people would not have said, hey, Kevin Folger is going to pastor the Cleveland Baptist Church. He's going to be able to, because of that, have an opportunity to speak on some national platforms. Nobody would have envisioned that for me. I didn't envision it for me. But God allowed that because of, again, leaders in my life following the openings that God gave to me and just trying to serve the Lord the best I can.
It's interesting to me that you would say that because in all honesty, if you asked me the question, it's actually a little bit funny to me that it wouldn't have been very different, my answer, because even the illustration about the car in the ditch, you can ask anybody from my church. It's one of my most common illustrations I use for anything, is I think we as people have a tendency to overcorrect. So we run from one problem to another, not realizing that, the road's here. And I would agree with that. I also appreciate what you say about mentors, because even biblically, I want to bring one verse into this for those listening. It's 2 Timothy. I don't know why I'm going to get it there. I've actually got it here where I can put it on the screen. But it's 2 Timothy 2:2, which is, and the things that thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also. I think in terms of a commandment within Scripture, it's profoundly commanded that we are to be mentored and being a mentor to somebody else.
Sure.
And you could probably disagree with me on this, but I think a tremendous example of this is in the life of Paul. That I understand most would look at Barnabas more as a contemporary to Paul as opposed to a mentor, but Barnabas is the one who brought him in. Without a Barnabas, the church would not have accepted Paul.
I totally agree with that. I actually, many times in preaching will say, who have you invested in? We think of the Apostle Paul, and we wouldn't have an Apostle Paul had Barnabas not wrapped his arm around him when nobody else wanted to. Here was a man who was willing to take a risk, and he was that kind of guy. He did that with John Mark, and later Paul when Paul and John and Barnabas separated over John Mark, it was at the end of Paul's life. He said, send Mark to me because he's valuable to me in the ministry. So he was the kind of guy that was always mentoring, always investing in others. And it's not always easy. Sometimes that's messy, and you got to get your hands dirty. You got to roll up your sleeves. And yet, we've got to do that. That's where people really become trained, I think, is when a preacher will take them aside, have a meal with them, bring them to their house, whatever, and just expose them to what life is like, in besides the church. It's, so.
Well, I think even a lot of that is expressed in Paul as well, as you look at the people he had turned around and then invested in. That he invested, of course, we know obviously with Timothy and Titus, but there's other people, and some of them didn't turn out. There's others that he has to say bad
Demas
stuff.
Hath forsaken me. Yeah, yes, sir. Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world. Yeah.
But I say even in myself, and this is why I say my answer wouldn't have been much different in terms, especially the part about mentor and home devotion, is that with even I myself, I didn't come from a Christian home or a Christian family. I didn't know anything about the Bible. When I got saved, I was a blank slate. I was nothing. And the pastor of that church, little by little, invested things in me. But very specifically, there was a man there who worked with a group building church buildings. And I would just volunteer my time when I wasn't in school, because I got saved and started preaching while I was still in school. And I would just volunteer my time, and I would go with him, and we would go build church buildings. And I remember he's the one who taught me a lot of the doctrine.
Amen. Mm-hmm.
But he's the one who prepared me for a lot of things. But then even going beyond that, when later on God moved me and I wound up in another church, which is where the church I went to Bible college at, that pastor took me under his wing like a son. I mean, my dad didn't get saved until much later. And so that man took me like a son to him. And right now, because of some doctrinal things, me and him can't be as close as we used to be, but there'll never be a time where I don't think about that.
Sure.
What he's invested in me cannot be quantified. And I can look a lot of men in my life that have had that involvement in me.
Sure.
So I absolutely agree with all of that. You almost got me talking about some stuff with missions, though, because I have some strong feelings about some stuff you hit on, but it's in a complete agreement with you. And it's some subjects I think people need to consider more. In fact, I will touch just this little bit, that I feel like one of the places that we fail in terms of setting men up, and this does go hand in hand with the idea, is that we don't train them, we don't invest in them. And so I see like a lot of guys will come straight from Bible college, never have really done anything in ministry, haven't really had a mentor, and we throw them in the mission field, and then they come off the field in a few months to a few years.
Yes, sir. Yeah,
with
very tragic. Yeah. Yes, sir.
And so I think in terms of broadening the idea of why spiritual leadership is so important, and why it's so important that we mentor and train people. Of course, I think as we go on, we can tie this into within the home and investing time in your own children. I think we can tie this into, investing time with people in your church. But I would even say in terms of just how to make it a broad subject, I think in general, that's where we see people fail, is because we equip them in some ways, but not in the ones that may be the most important, which is to actually give them the training they need.
Well, I sometimes hear, and because you're a missionary from America to a foreign country, that the path to the mission field is a difficult path, specifically the idea of raising support. And yet I'm of the firm persuasion, if a guy can't cut it, raising his support, he's never going to cut it when he has a hard time on the mission field. And he's going to face it, that. But yet we want to make it easier for these people to get to the mission field. And I'm not saying that it should be extremely hard, but the truth of the matter is there's a process to every product. And if we cut the process, you're gonna dilute the end result. And I think, there's a reason that there's some trials in getting to the mission field, because it prepares a person for some trials later on. And again, I know there's the Southern Baptist method, just, hey, send the missionaries, they don't have to raise their support. But I'm not sure that's healthy. And
I can tell you from firsthand experience, it's not. There's a guy, I don't want to get into it because there's not many people it could be in the country. It's not like there's many missionaries. But there's a guy here that it kind of breaks my heart every time I see him, because he's been here for a long time. But when he got to this country, he was sent as a hireling, essentially. He left the field where he was at. They said, where do you want to go next? And he picked Belgium because of a language situation. And since he's been here, he came in, and the evangelical churches, which they tried to do this to me as well, the evangelical church told him, we have churches in Belgium. You don't need to start a church. Just come help us. And so for years, he's been collecting a paycheck from the Southern Baptist Convention to bounce around between evangelical churches like an evangelist, just preaching here and there and everywhere on Sundays. And he's been here, I mean, a long time, but he's never tried to start a church, never tried to do any of those things. He's a nice guy, but that's the problem with that situation.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
But I'm absolutely in fact, the more you say, the more I think we should have done this on missions. Maybe we have to do another time talking about missions.
Well, we can do it.
This is something I feel genuinely strong about, is that we fail missionaries because of the fact that and even a lot of young men fail in ministry, period, because of the fact that they try to skip ahead. They don't want to pay their dues.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I agree.
For me personally, I mean, like I say, I have to stop and think about how old I am. 32 still. But I'm 32 years old. I've been preaching now for 17 going on 18 years. And I've only been a missionary in Belgium for 3.5 years now. I spent most of my time working under somebody else in a Moses to Joshua situation and just doing whatever my pastor needed of me. I also worked as an evangelist, but that was in addition to that.
Yeah. Well, how many guys coming out of Bible college, they're in their early 20s. There may be some guys that are a little bit older, get saved later in life or called to ministry later in life, that are a little older and have a little bit more seasoning. But for the most guys coming out of Bible college, they're not ready to pastor a church. Yeah. They're not ready to plant a church. They really need, I firmly believe that every young man coming out of Bible college needs a couple of years working with a seasoned pastor, just learning the practical aspects of ministry. So
I think they need to have something.
Yeah.
I'll read that in a moment. I think they need to have something because, and this will go back to missions, and then maybe I can move on, but it also allows me to get to my next point. That my experience watching missionaries raising support is that the missionaries who had been already active in ministry were the ones who raised it faster. And if we believe God's in charge of this, that he's the one who gives it to you, then I think that testifies to something, is that they didn't need the long, hard road of deputation for the weeding out process and the preparation. Already pastored a church, already been evangelist, was raised on the mission field. Have something that helps you to be ready for what you're going to experience.
Yeah. Well, when I was pastoring the church back, I'm guessing going back maybe 15 years ago, we had a missions conference and we invited this family to come in. They were going, and I don't need to even go into where they were going, but this is a young couple, had a couple of children. The wife, I mean, she was just so protective of her kids that, we were having some problems with just, the way things were and the way things were being handled with the family, that I took the man aside. They said, look, I'm asking you to go home. You're not going to finish this conference with us. You're a distraction. Your family is not ready for the mission field. And, he looked at me and of course, I think it stunned him. But I said, the truth of the matter is, I said, you don't have your family under control and you don't have your household the way it should be. And I said, so anyway, to make a long story short, he went home and they pulled back from going to the mission field because he did have some things he needed to work on. But the truth of the matter is, it would have been easy just to look another way from the red flag and let him go on. But that's just not fair. It's not fair to the work of God. And it's not fair to him, specifically when a seasoned man like myself could look at him and see some things that needed to be addressed.
This probably answers my next question already. I think we've already been, actually, the two questions that could be combined in one, because I was going to ask what would you say is most important, but I think you've already hit that. In terms of practice in your life to be a godly leader. But my next one was going to be about where do you see men struggle the most? And it seems like we've already probably answered that question, is that men just struggle because they're not equipped. Yeah,
I think that's part of it. Again, we're living in a day and age when a lot of things are I think, being short-circuited. And, I have to tell you that to see families in ministry today is vitally important. My wife and I, we raised our kids. We have 3 sons. Our oldest son is a businessman. My middle son's the pastor here at the Cleveland Baptist Church, and my youngest son's the associate pastor at the church in Indianapolis. They were all raised in ministry. All of our kids are in church. They're all serving the Lord. They all, are faithful to the things of God. But I hear people say, well, you really can't raise your kids in ministry and turn them out today. That's just not true. You have to work at it. My kids, when they were being raised, I wanted them to know, number one, they had a dad who loved them and who was going to be there for them. While I had responsibility in ministry, I had no greater responsibility in ministry than my own family, because I felt like if I lost my family, then I would lose whatever credibility I would have in ministry. So our kids were involved. I mean, they were involved in bus routes. They were involved in our church's extracurricular activities, all the stuff, the youth ministry, and they wanted to be. So it wasn't like we had to bring them dragging and kicking. And a lot of that, I think, is just what's going on in the home. Do they see reality or do they see hypocrisy in the home? So I think we have to be very, very upfront that, are we perfect? No. But, we're going to be real Christians that, if I did something wrong as a dad or as a husband, I had to own it, and I needed to own it before my kids. And the truth of the matter was, there were times when I'd say to our kids, look, financially, we're having a hard time. We need to pray and ask God to do something. And, to be honest with our kids about stuff like that, and then they see God work, is just, there's no way to say, well, you shouldn't do that. No, our kids needed to see that. And it helped them to have faith as they were going to Bible college. All three of my boys, when they went to school, I said, look, there's very little I'm going to be able to do for you financially when you go to college. You're going to have to work your way through. And many of them had friends who looked at them at college and said, well, your dad's a pastor of a big church. Why isn't he helping you? Because I said, you tell your friends that your dad's trying to raise men who are responsible and know how to work and not just have things handed to them. And so I think part of it is just that if we're not careful, we coddle our kids too much. We don't allow them to suffer or to face hardship or difficulty. And so I would encourage, our listeners to realize, hey, the struggles in a pastor's home or in a missionary's home are very real, but we can't ignore them. We have to be real about it and help our kids to see, hey, there's a God in heaven who can work us through these issues and help us.
All right. Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think in terms of the question of what's most important, what do we struggle with, I think is kind of a circle of an answer in that, in regards to, that home devotion life, that close personal walk, that integrity, and then also that idea of being equipped. I think those two issues probably go hand in hand, where it'd be hard to separate the two. Because even we could introduce a question that was not addressed before, and that was the question of, where do we start training people? And I think you've already addressed that as well. We start as soon as we can. Timothy, I think, is again an example of that Timothy seems to have been taught from the time that he was a child by his mother and grandmother. They were already preparing him to be a godly man.
Absolutely.
And then Paul took him as early as he could get him.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you see a lot of that there as well. Let me give a few questions. I don't want to keep you all day, so let me give a few questions about pastoral authority, because I do think that's a subject we kind of hit around it, and maybe it's a time to get into it a little bit. And that would be, my first question would be, what should a church expect of a pastor in regards to taking authority in situations and so forth?
Well, again, I don't know that you would want to call a man that you don't have confidence in. So, I'm a firm believer that part of a responsibility of a pastor is to train his successor. And so if we look at like the Cleveland Baptist Church, and I know not every church is like our church, but if our church is working on its 63rd anniversary, it's, so it's now 62 years old, to be 63 this coming August. It's had 3 pastors. It's a very strong, very vibrant church. One of the reasons for that is because it's never been without a pastor. And the first pastor trained his successor. I trained my successor. So I feel like in some respects that when a man takes over, I knew even as I followed a man who pastored the church for 37 years, there were some things probably that needed to change in our church, just processes, nothing doctrinally, anything like that. But I also knew that I just didn't have the right to come in because, okay, now I'm the new pastor, I can start yanking things around. It takes you a while to learn to earn the respect of the people. And I feel like people make a terrible mistake in thinking, okay, I'm the pastor, I can do whatever I need to do, and nobody should question that. And I think that's ridiculous. People are going to question you, and you should be willing to give it an account for your leadership. And we can talk a little bit more how that works a little bit later on. But I would say that the longer you're at a place and you have a track record of being balanced, you have a track record of not being knee-jerk, reactionary, making good and wise decisions, the easier it's going to be for people to say, let's give the pastor authority to make those decisions. I think the constitution and bylaws of a church should kind of line out what kind of authority the pastor has. I think it's biblical that a man pastors a church, but there's no such thing as just absolute pastoral authority with no one being able to question that. I feel like that's a terrible place for us to be, or for someone to think that they should be able to be there. None of us are above questioning. None of us are above someone asking, why are you doing this? Or why did you preach this? Or why do you take this particular position? During this COVID thing, specifically, it's been very difficult for pastors because they've had to make a lot of decisions based on the limited information they had at the moment. And some of them, of course, now looking back, said, man, I wish I hadn't made that decision. Well, or I've learned and I'm not going to make that decision again. But, some of these guys are in a no-win situation because they got people in their church who are absolutely think this whole thing's a hoax. You should not be concerned. You have other people who think that you're not taking it seriously enough. So in some respects, a pastor can't win in the COVID response to the pandemic. But on the other side, whatever position a man takes, he should be able to give an answer for why he's doing what he's doing. And so as far as the pastoral authority, I think biblically, God gives the pastor authority to lead a church, not to drive a church, not to, browbeat a church, but to lead a church spiritually, like a shepherd would lead sheep. He's to lead his flock. He's the under shepherd under the Lord Jesus Christ, and so that needs to be done in a loving, compassionate way.
I would agree. The reason I asked the question is because actually you touched on this a little bit earlier, talking about the idea of two ditches, is that within churches, I see that there tends to be philosophies of either you run to the ditch where it's a deacon-led church and the pastor is scared to say anything, or you run to the other ditch where the pastor is almost deified to the point where if he tells you to marry somebody, you go marry that person because he said so.
Yes.
And of course, like you've already pointed out, either ditch is dangerous.
Yes, sir. I think sometimes these churches that have the deacon-led church, part of the reason for that is because they've been without a pastor so long that authority is missing. It's a vacuum that somebody's going to take a hold of. And once somebody gets that kind of authority, sometimes it's difficult to give it back, And unless they're a very godly person who realizes, hey, we just did this because we had to do it until God gave us a leader. There are other people that thrive on being in charge, and so I think we have to again have a balance in that. I think when a man comes to take a church, God calls him there. I think there needs to be an understanding between him and the whoever the leadership is. Obviously, the deacons, but if there's staff or other people just before the church to say, God's called me here to lead. I'm going to do my best to lead you. I'm not going to beg for the opportunity to make a decision when it needs to. And we need to talk about, where we need to have church votes and where we need to give the pastor the liberty and the freedom to be able to operate, but being willing to give an account for what he does.
I agree with that completely. I guess that's why even when my other question, which is essentially the same question, was how far does pastoral authority reach, which again is one of those I think you've already more or less answered the idea.
Yes, sir.
But I think it is a subject that needs to be addressed because I find myself there's times where because I do consider myself to be more middle of the road in this, that our church is very much, I started it, so I have all the liberty in terms of being the leader of the church, but I also try to make sure I'm held accountable by the Word of God. And that I don't, just beat the people and this is how we're going to do it. Sure. But I see many times a lot of preachers that people come to me from other churches and so forth, and they have this philosophy that they're not allowed to question a pastor, or I have the other side where they come to me and they feel like they don't have to listen to a pastor about anything.
Yes, sir. Yeah, it's tough, and there is balance. Balance is the key to all of it, isn't it? I mean, really, being balanced in what we do.
No, I would agree with that. And then I think this is where we were naturally going is, how do we ensure accountability for a pastor? What would you recommend in that regard?
Well, when I became the pastor of the church, the founding pastor really had very few deacons meetings, and he basically was the founding pastor, and he just felt like, hey, I've got this authority, I'm going to use it, and he wasn't an abuser of authority, so don't get me wrong. But I thought as a younger man coming in, taking the church, that I needed to have a sounding board. So when I met with our deacons, here's what I said to them. I said, look, I know that I have the authority as the pastor to lead this church, but I'm willfully and purposely allowing you men to be my accountability. So, I will give you reports every month on finances, and, when I have issues that are coming up, things that we need to discuss, I'm going to discuss it with you. So that's how we kind of had some accountability for financial aspects. I set our staff salaries, and then the deacons had a financial aspect that set my salary, because I didn't feel like I wanted to set my own. I didn't feel like that was probably wise to do so. And so, again, it's just, I think you just have to, kind of say, okay, well, how does this work? But I do think that, it can get to a point where if you are not careful, the deacons are running the church. And, so there has to be this balance in saying, I don't have to ask you for permission to do what I know God wants us to do, but I'm willing to be accountable for how I run the church, and feel free to be able to ask me questions, because I feel like I should be able to answer those things as you ask them.
That's essentially my philosophy of it. In fact, that's what I would say my experience has been when you see somebody coming from one of those churches where the pastor has the almost deified personality, is that you don't question him.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And so I think people should, sometimes we undersell the importance of having a leader in our life and a pastor who can help us. So I think people should feel comfortable to go to a pastor for advice. I think we have to be reminded that pastors can be wrong. Their advice is not infallible. I've been wrong, I'm sure. There's plenty of times. My personal philosophy on business meetings and all this kind of stuff, and you're welcome to disagree with me. It's not a problem. Is that, and it's easier for me because I am the founding pastor of this church. We're still, getting on our feet. Is that I meet with the men that I lean on more as leaders, but we don't really have a structure in terms of you're a deacon, you're this. Sure. But I meet with them from time to time. We have a group where we use a lot with a program we have here that you don't really use in the States, but we have a group, we talk to one another through that. And then in terms of business meetings for the church, we really don't do them. My experience, and as long as you pastored, I imagine you're probably going to feel the same way. My experience has been that there's more harm than good that comes out of a public business meeting. Yeah.
So what we ended up doing at our church was, again, all the financial details basically were discussed with the deacons. They had the right to ask any question they needed to when they got a financial statement. So once a year, we would give an end of the year financial statement to our church, but it wasn't a business meeting. Basically, it was here's what came in, here was how it was spent. If you have questions, you can ask the deacons or you can come and talk to us. But, we're not going to, here's every check that's been written in. I mean, because in a ministry our size, it was just unbelievable that, how much money would take to operate. And most people wouldn't understand that. So, you have a group of men who do have an understanding of it. And then at the end of the year, give just basically a one-page financial summary of the ministry, so you're accountable. But that was kind of our philosophy. We didn't vote. We didn't have church meetings to vote people in, other than if somebody joins the church, are you willing to take them in? That type of thing. We would every once in a while have to vote some folks out. Those were kind of church business meetings that we had to deal with, and those were not pleasant moments, but they were necessary. But that was that's kind of the way things are operated here, and still today still operate. So.
Well, it's not so different than what we've set up here. I've tried very hard to watch what I've seen succeed and what I've seen fail, what causes troubles, and then just get away from the basic structure of, well, this is how, you have to do it this way because this is how everybody does it. You do a business meeting quarterly or monthly or however. And so for us, I talk to those men. I go to them when I need somebody's, to help be accountable for the decision and so forth. I include them in those kind of things when I need that extra leadership in that part. But in terms of a business meeting, we essentially do the same thing you're discussing. Is that actually we do it the first Sunday of the year. We discuss the vision for the church, talk about some of the things from the past year, and so it's not so different. But I'm glad to hear that that's actually the way you did it, because it helps me to see that it's not that crazy of an idea. But I think these are some things maybe as far as for pastors that would help them to consider. And I think for people in a church, they need to consider this, because I know my experience with people coming from the States and people who have more experience in a church is that they have more expectation for, well, let me know what's going on. I want to know how much money is being spent on everything. Let me control. And I think it would help people to realize that if you've got a pastor who's doing a good job, he doesn't need to be without accountability. Somebody should be looking over his shoulder. But I do think that sometimes the individuals in the church probably do need to relax a little bit and let that leadership structure of the church take care of it.
You don't want to hamstring your pastor and, can he buy, if the church needs toilet paper, does he have to come and get a church vote? That's crazy. Churches split over carpet colors and wall colors and stuff like that. That's foolishness. So, we got bigger things to do. And, I think if we can get our church to the point where that we're soul conscious, that, hey, this church operates to win souls, see people saved, baptized, discipled, the other things kind of fall into place, unless, the devil always trying to get in the mix. So pastors have to be careful that they don't allow themselves to be, to the point that they're being a dictator. Neither should the church get to the point where they're hamstringing the pastor and keeping him from doing what needs to be done. So again, we go back to this idea of balance in the walk of what a way church operates.
Well, I think a lot of that for pastors, that fine line that will help them is to never get to the point where people can't question you about why.
Right. I agree. Yes, sir. Yes.
I think for pastors, that's probably one of the biggest things. Just remember, you're not infallible, and you do need to explain sometimes.
Sure.
For the church, I think it's a matter of realizing that God did design this to be led by a pastor, and those men that are in a leadership position, of course, sure. And that's why they're there, is to help keep some degree of accountability. And so that's why, you have people who know what's going on financially. You don't have to know where every penny's spent, because I do know churches. And that's why you say it, you say it, people may think you're joking, but I know churches that pastor's allowed to spend up to $100. If he spends more than $100, he has to hold a business meeting to find out.
Yeah. Crazy.
And it's sometimes just basic stuff that you need it. You have to have this, but he still has to do it. And to me, it's crazy.
Yeah.
But I do, in terms of accountability, I'll say this. I do think somebody needs to know what's going on and stuff. And it's different. Again, as a missionary, I pay for most everything out of a church out of my pocket anyway. So I have a mission board that I report everything I spend to them and so forth. So I have extra layers of accountability. But I say this because there's a church in my area that they financially were probably one of the most successful churches in that area. And a guy come in and said, look, we're not doing business meetings. We're not printing any expense reports. We're not talking about this anymore. And he bankrupted the church almost overnight. Because nobody was watching what he was doing. They did want to give him that position. They wanted to give him that trust. And so I'm just saying this, not to change anything you said, but to emphasize why that balance is important, that you have men who help in the leadership, but also people kind of relax.
Yeah, there needs to be some sort of financial reckoning, and I always, depending on the size of the ministry, I've always encouraged churches to have an outside accounting firm at least look at their books annually, if not quarterly, and do just a review to make sure that there's nothing improper that's going on there. That it helps two ways. Number one, it keeps things, appropriate. Number two is if you ever have to go to a bank to borrow some money, even if it's short term, you don't have to go through the rigmarole of having books set in order, because they're already in order, which is helpful. So
accountability is very important. I think we can't underestimate how important it is.
Absolutely.
And I'll get to my last question because, again, I don't want to hold you all day. And that is, how do you recommend to someone to try to recognize good leaders and to invest in those people?
I think those of us, and I think spiritual people, you don't have to be in ministry, but spiritual people recognize the fact that God is working in someone's life, has a plan for them. I think that that's pretty clear. We had an old man here in our church who years ago was, one of my responsibilities early in the ministry was senior adults here at our church. So I started a senior adult ministry. And so my wife and I we were young, we had small kids, had 3 little boys. And of course, these were older people. And so they loved us, and gave me an opportunity to, work with older adults and mature people. So there was an old man who took a real liking to my middle son, Peter, who's the pastor here. And he, every time we'd go out making calls, he and his wife said, well, hey, let us watch the kids. And so many times Peter end up at their house, and their apartment. And he said, I come in and he said, hey, Pete's been preaching today. He had my little Bible. He said, he's going to be a greater preacher than Billy Graham. And of course, he meant that as a compliment, not thinking about any type of compromise or anything in the realm of work, but just the preaching ability. And so I think to myself that even as a boy, here's an older man who was spiritual, who saw in this young child a desire to do spiritual things. And, Pete was called to ministry early in life. That's in high school. I think he was a junior in high school when he settled it, went off to Bible college, came back to work for us and worked 18 years on the staff before he became the pastor. And so, I mean, it's just, you see those type of things in people, and you see the fact that, hey, it looks like God's hands on this person's life. I can see them in ministry. I can see them on the mission field, or you see them growing, taking on responsibility. So I think that's how you see it. It's not, God just kind of opens up your eyes to see those that he's working in their lives and taking them perhaps to the next step or the next level spiritually, and will impress upon your heart to kind of get in there and kind of mentor them a little bit.
I think if I was to give an answer on it, it would be explained different, but it'd be the same answer. And that I think preachers need to apply maybe a 1 Corinthians chapter 1 mentality, that it's not necessarily the wisest or the smartest.
Right.
It's that person who's sincere in their desire to be used of God.
Sure.
Because that's been, again, something that I've watched over the years to see a lot of fellas struggle with, is they'll pick a guy based off of something that stands out. He can sing, so this is definitely going to be a good pastor.
No, I get that. Yeah, I understand. But I think I think you and I are on the same page. I think there's something the Lord does in our heart that says, hey, not just based on talent or gifts, but it is, you can just see there's something happening in the life of that individual. So.
The sincerity that there's actually something there that they want to serve God. You don't have to twist their arm and make them go.
Right.
There's some genuineness to their desire.
Yeah.
And that's, again, having sat back for a few years watching. I don't have nearly as many. I mean, you've got more years in the ministry than I've been alive, so I'm not trying to act like I'm some grand expert, but I'm good at watching and understanding stuff.
Sure.
I was a machinist, so my job was to look at something, figure out how it works, and understand it.
Okay.
So I say that because what I've seen is the guys who stick it out, the ones who tend to be, I think everybody's worth the investment to some degree or another, but the guys who really seem to pay back in dividends are the ones that you don't pick them because of some great talent they have. It's not necessarily the guy with the highest IQ or the most likable. It's the guy who's really sincere. He has some desire. He may be the quietest person, but he has some desire to actually be there. Yeah. And maybe the better example of what I mean is I've known a lot of churches that they pick their deacons based off of who had, this guy's a local businessman. He surely knows how to manage money.
He's a leader. He's not a servant. He's a leader. But obviously servant leadership, and that's vitally important.
And so I think we've hit everything I need to get to. There was a question asked in regards to whether somebody should be married before they pastor. I don't know that I want to open that can of worms, just because that is something where people will be subject to their opinions on it. I think when it comes to divorce and pastoring and so forth, that's something that's a little more easy to give a clear, this is what I believe. But in terms of whether somebody's required to be married or not, that's going to be a lot of, this is what I feel, this is what I feel on it kind of thing.
I would agree. I tend to believe that, that it helps a man to be married if he's pastoring a church in so many ways. But that doesn't mean that a man, can't not be married, because there have been some men who have been widowed in the ministry and have not remarried, and they're still continuing to pastor a church. And I get that, why that would be the case. So, all in all, I think it's very helpful for a man to have a wife walk by his side in the ministry, just in so many ways. So
I think we can agree on that as well. That I think if you push me to give an answer, it'd be that it's better for him to be, but it's not necessarily a requirement.
Right. Yeah.
There's a lot of things that I wouldn't be able to do without my family, and I see that more now. I didn't get married until I was in my late 20s, and so I spent the majority of my ministry by myself. And admittedly, there's a truth that there were some things that I was more free to do. I could go work a full-time job, stay up half the night going to a preacher's meeting, and then driving back home and so forth. I could preach 5 times on Sunday. It was not a big deal. Now that I have a family and I have to account for stuff, I have to be a little more careful with all of that.
Well, I'm just the opposite of that. I got married when I was 18. My first son was born when I was 19. I had all 3 of my kids by the time I was 23. So
I've got 3 now, but I'll be 33 this year. So and
well,
they're all very small.
Different. It was a different world back in the 70s. That's for sure. So.
In fact, I think I hear one of them coming to interrupt me now. So he's probably going to get in trouble in a minute. Well, brother, I really tremendously appreciate you joining with me in this. I don't see any more questions coming in the comments. I did have to give somebody a timeout because they were trying to tell when the rapture was going to take place in the comments. But other than that, it's mostly been people from our church just mentioning stuff. So if anybody does have a question, it's the last chance, and you got to type fast because I'm not going to wait for it. But brother, I really do appreciate it. Is there anything in particular you would like to say?
No, just to ask that folks would pray for us. I start tomorrow my 2021 travel calendar. I'm going to be kind of local here tomorrow, and then next week I'm going to be in Texas. The following week in North Carolina. The following week I'm going to be back in the area, and then going to be out in California. So we're going to be all over the place. My itinerary and travel schedule is found at my website, kevinfolger.org, or at the sl-asia.com website. And so folks can go there. And but if you pray for us as we travel, God to give us favor with people. I don't need to raise personal support. We are raising support for national pastors, and those are some of the things that we're trying to do right now. As God brings people into our life, we would like to be able to help them financially. And then just pray that this COVID, of course, everybody's affected by it, but if COVID would lift, certainly would be a help to us in trying to get our big conferences started again, and even some regional things that we want to get going. So by the grace of God, sometime in 2021, I'm going to be over in Asia for at least a week, and then 2022 we'll be back for the big conference. So,
all right. Okay. I give this thought as a kind of a closing recap and things that I guess the big takeaway for me for all of this to give to people is that whether you're talking about being a leader of your home, leader in your church, leader anywhere, the most important thing is to spend that time alone with God, and of course in your family, have that time as a family with God, because I think that's going to be the key in all of it. And then beyond that, the next thing that goes hand in hand with it is to be well equipped. Sure. Don't just rush into it. There's a reason why God said not to make a novice into a pastor.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, sir.
And so I think for a lot of us, we need to step back. Like if you're a man working in a church under somebody and you're trying to come along and help him, then remember he's the pastor. You're there to help him. So servant leadership, as was said. Yeah. Have a heart to get in there and do whatever you can to help. And it's not that you can't ask questions and offer advice. Those are more than welcome. Just remember that offering advice doesn't mean he has to go and change his direction to follow your course.
Right.
I see that's where a lot of people in church tend to struggle, is they think because they offer advice, the pastor's obligated to change course that way. But you're trying to help, not steer the ship.
Amen.
And then in terms of just where people struggle, I think it comes down to the same thing as well. In terms of what to look for in people and what I think you as an individual, just talking to the audience, should be trying to grow within yourself, is that sincerity, that drive that you really want to do something for God. That I think will supersede any abilities or so forth. And if you want to understand what I mean, just sit down and study that last part of 1 Corinthians 1, where Paul goes into that what God needs more than anything in a servant is not your abilities, but your availability, your willingness to serve.
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, I tremendously appreciate it. I enjoyed it. You've convinced me that if we find another time it works for you, maybe we should talk about missions, because
I'd love to do it. I'd love to.
there's a lot of good stuff
It's a
there.
passion of mine for sure. But Brother Haley, thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation today, and pray that God will bless your work and ministry over there in Belgium.
We appreciate that. Thank you, brother. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and close out the live stream. I appreciate everyone having been a part of it, and hope it's a blessing to each.